Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know what we do here. We sit with men who came to the Philippines chasing something. Love, peace, a second act, a cheaper cost of living, a way out of whatever was waiting for them back home. And we let them tell you exactly what happened. Most of the time, those stories end in a particular way. Money gone, heartbroken, lesson learned the hard way and at considerable expense. This one is a bit different. Brendan is 54 years old. He's from Cork in the south of Ireland. He spent 26 years in IT support, retired recently, and arrived in Cebu City with a plan so thoroughly researched it had its own folder structure. He is not a naive man. He is not an impulsive man. He is, by his own description, a man who has made a career out of identifying exactly what other people did wrong. And yet, what happened to Brendan in the Philippines didn't look like a disaster from the outside. No single catastrophic moment. No dramatic confrontation. Just a slow, quiet rearrangement of things he thought were settled. He came back to Ireland 9 months later, changed in ways he's still working out how to describe. He agreed to tell us his story because he thinks it might be more useful than the ones that end in total ruin. The men who lose everything, he says, you watch their story and you think, well, I'd never do that. Brendan's story is the one where you think, I might do exactly that. And that, he reckons, is worth more. Here's his story, in his own words. I have a notebook not on my phone, not a spreadsheet, though I have those too. An actual notebook, spiral-bound, the kind you'd buy in a newsagent for €2. I've kept one for about 15 years. Every euro in, every euro out. Groceries, petrol, the odd pint. I started doing it during the second marriage, when money was always somehow disappearing and neither of us could ever explain where it had gone. Kept doing it after. Habit, I suppose. Or control, probably both. The third marriage ended on a Thursday in October. I remember that detail because I had a dental appointment that afternoon and I kept it. Went home, sat in the car outside the flat for a while, then went in and made a ham sandwich. Not because I was hungry, just because it was 6 o'clock and that's when you make your tea. Third time you go through something, the shock has mostly worn off. What you're left with is something quieter. More like recognizing a streak you've walked down before. She wasn't a bad person. None of them were. That's the version I've arrived at, anyway. The first one said I was emotionally absent. She wasn't wrong, looking at it now. The second lasted 9 years, gave me 2 kids who treat me with the careful politeness of people managing a relative they're not sure about. The third, we just ran out of things to say and eventually noticed we'd stopped trying to find them. I signed the papers without much ceremony, drove home, made the sandwich. So, that's who I am. I want to be clear about that before any of this makes sense. I retired at 53. HSE pension, decent enough, about €2,500 a month. And I had savings, 120,000, give or take. 26 years of logging every euro in and out will do that. I had a 1-bedroom flat in Bolincollig that I owned outright, which is a small suburb outside Cork that you've never heard of and doesn't matter. The flat was fine. Clean, warm, good broadband. Felt enormous for one person, but I'd felt that way about places before, and it passes. My son rings at Christmas. My daughter rang last Easter, which was a pleasant surprise. I don't say that bitterly. Just as a fact. The shape of my life at that point, accurate inventory. The YouTube thing started about a month after the retirement. Late nights, couldn't sleep, the usual. I want to say I stumbled across it, but that would be generous to the algorithm. Those videos are aimed at men my age, like a laser. 50-something Western lads, sitting alone, watching other 50-something Western lads walk around warm countries looking pleased with themselves. The cost of living videos especially. Somebody standing in a market somewhere, holding up mangoes, telling you what they paid. It's almost comedic how well it works if you're in the right state of mind. I looked at Thailand first. I have nothing against Thailand, but there's a specific look that some men come home from Thailand with, and I'd rather not. Portugal was the sensible answer, but the sensible answer had become too expensive 2 years ago, and I'd missed the window. Vietnam interested me briefly. Nice-looking place, food I'd eat. But the language, I took one look at the tones and the diacritics and thought, no, I'm 53, not 30. Some things are beyond me now, and I've made my peace with it. The Philippines had a few, not tourist English, actual English, first language for most purposes, bilingual from childhood. That mattered to me practically. And the Catholic thing. I'm not a believer, haven't been since about 1987, but I grew up in it, and I know how it works. The guilt, the ritual, the way people talk about God's will as a kind of explanation for things that don't have one. I understood that world. It's the same world I grew up in, just sunnier and louder. And the costs. Jesus, the costs. I built a spreadsheet. Of course I built a spreadsheet. Accommodation, food, transport, health care, visa requirements, average temperatures in January. The Philippines came out well. Better than I'd expected. A decent apartment in Cebu for less than €500 a month. Street food for a few hundred pesos. A lifestyle that my pension, on its own, could sustain without touching the savings. I booked the flight on a Tuesday evening in January. Not a dramatic moment. I'd been researching for 8 months. At some point you've done enough research, and the next logical step is to go. I closed the laptop, opened the notebook, wrote down the flight cost, €460 return, and went to bed. I landed in Cebu City on a Saturday morning in February. The heat when you step out of the airport is a thing unto itself. Not just warm, it lands on you like something physical. I stood outside Mapta on arrivals with my bag, sweating through my jacket before I'd managed to take it off, and a man immediately appeared offering me a taxi at 3 times the going rate. I'd read about this. I'd prepared for this. I smiled, said no thank you, found the grab queue and paid 230 pesos to get into the city. About €3.80. I'd found the apartment online before I left. A serviced place in La Hug, 28,000 pesos a month, roughly €470. Ground floor unit, aircon in every room, decent kitchen, Wi-Fi that actually worked. I tested the Wi-Fi the minute I arrived, because 26 years in IT support means that's where your priorities are. It held up. Good sign. Ate in the turo places, those canteen spots where the food's all laid out and you point at what you want, which suited me fine because pointing at things is a communication style I'm comfortable with. Walked the malls. SM Seaside mostly, which is enormous and air-conditioned, and you can spend an afternoon there without being troubled by anything. Sat in coffee shops near IT Park with the laptop. Watched the city. People ask if I was lonely. Honestly, not the way you'd expect. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being in a familiar place where everyone knows you. Baling colleague knew about the 3 marriages. My colleagues knew. The woman in the Centra knew. You could see it in the careful way she asked how I was getting on. In Cebu, nobody knew anything about me. I was just a quiet Irish fella in his 50s with sensible shoes and a notebook. The anonymity was something I hadn't expected to feel like relief, but it did. I wasn't looking for a woman. I want to say that clearly, not because it changes what happened, but because it's true and it's relevant to understanding how it happened. I'd had 3 marriages. I wasn't under any illusion that I was good at that particular thing. I'd come to Cebu to stop making noise for a while. The problem with stopping is that it means you're standing still. and things can find you when you're standing still in a way they can't when you're moving. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first thing you notice about Cebu after the heat is the sound. I don't mean the traffic, though there's plenty of that. Jeepneys grinding through the Lehug intersections at all hours, tricycles weaving between them with a confidence that suggests the drivers have made a private arrangement with whatever god they prefer. I mean, something underneath all that. The city has a constant low hum to it, even at 2 in the morning. Karaoke from somewhere nearby. A rooster, and I want to be specific here because people back home think the rooster at dawn thing is a quaint rural detail. In Cebu City, in a residential area, 2 minutes walk from a 7-Eleven, there is a rooster. Several roosters. They don't wait for dawn. They're available around the clock, seemingly without schedule or purpose. I lay awake the first 2 nights cataloging the sounds, and then, sometime in the 3rd week, stopped noticing them entirely. That, I think, was the moment I started actually living there, rather than visiting. I got into a routine quickly. That's what I do. I'm a routines person. In IT support, you learn that most disasters happen when someone deviates from a process. Apply that to daily life, and you end up with a routine. Up at 6:30, coffee from the 7-Eleven on the corner. They do a decent enough machine coffee for 45 pesos, about 75 cents, and I was not yet ready to become the sort of man who pays 300 pesos for something with a name in Italian, laptop open by 7, an hour reading, catching up on news, answering the occasional email from my son, who communicates primarily in brief functional messages as though corresponding with a utilities provider. Then out into the city. I walked a lot in those, more than I'd walked in years, if I'm being honest. The Irish climate does not encourage pedestrianism, and my previous life had involved a car, a desk, and a return commute of 40 minutes each way, none of which constituted exercise. Cebu was different. The heat was an obstacle, but I found that if you started early and kept to the shaded side of the street, you could move around reasonably without dissolving. I walked down to the waterfront. I walked through the Carbon Market once, which is the old public market near the port, a loud, dense, extraordinary place full of fish and vegetables and noise, and which I will confess I found somewhat overwhelming and did not return to for several weeks. I walked the length of Colon Street, which is supposedly the oldest street in the Philippines, a fact several people mentioned to me as though I should be more visibly impressed by it. I ate well and cheaply. The turo places had become comfortable. Once you accept that the system works and stop trying to read a menu that doesn't exist, you just point at the chicken adobo and the rice and hand over 70 pesos and that's your lunch. Done. I tried lechon at a place on General Maxilam that a woman in the apartment building had recommended. Roast pig, crackling so good it seemed improbable. I ate it standing at a plastic table and thought, all right. There are worse places to be 53. I wasn't unhappy. That's the thing I want to be clear about. This isn't the story of a man so miserable that any warmth felt like a lifeline. I was quite genuinely fine. I had enough money, enough comfort, enough quiet. I called my daughter once a week on a Sunday, which she mostly tolerated, and I sent my son a message every few days that he occasionally replied to. I read 3 books I'd been meaning to read for 2 years. I slept without the specific weight that had been sitting on my chest for most of the previous decade. But there's a particular kind of fine that starts to feel, after a while, like a waiting room. You're comfortable, nothing is. You're just not entirely sure what you're waiting for. I was about 5 weeks in when I saw the flyer. It was in a coffee shop on Salinas Drive, one of those places with exposed brick and small wooden tables, and a menu that uses the word artisanal more than I'd consider strictly necessary. I'd started going there in the mornings because the Wi-Fi was faster than the 7-Eleven and they didn't mind if you sat for 2 hours. The flyer was handwritten, stuck to a corkboard near the door beside an ad for guitar lessons and a card from a property agent. It said, Irish-Filipino pub, contact Ciaran. There was a number with a local prefix. I took a photo of it. Didn't immediately do anything with the photo. Went home, made tea, opened the notebook, and had a think. Here's the thing about being an IT person in an unfamiliar system. The instinct is always to observe before touching anything. You watch how the system behaves under normal conditions before you start poking around. I'd been in Cebu 5 weeks and had successfully avoided becoming part of anything, which was comfortable and also, if I'm being completely honest, a pub quiz run by a man named Ciaran represented a very specific social risk. Irish people abroad seeking other Irish people, which historically leads either to a genuine friendship or to spending a Thursday night listening to someone else's opinions about the Irish football team. I was not confident about which was more likely, but it was Thursday, and the alternative was watching something on the laptop with a half-second audio delay while eating adobo from the Turo Turo place, and I had done that the previous 4 Thursdays in a row. I texted Ciaran. He replied in about 3 minutes with an address in IT Park and said to come at 7 and bring 200 pesos for the entry fee. €12, roughly, with food included. I wrote it in the notebook, reasonable. The bar was easy to find. A low building, open-fronted, the kind of place that depends on a ceiling fan and goodwill to manage the heat. Ciaran turned out to be from Waterford. He corrected me when I guessed Kilkenny, with the quiet intensity of a man for whom this distinction matters, and had been in Cebu for 11 years, married to a woman named Jonalyn, with 2 daughters in the local school. He ran the quiz with a microphone and a printed sheet and the comfortable authority of a man who'd been doing this for long enough that it had become a civic institution. There were about 15 people there. Western men, mostly, various ages, various nationalities. I stood at the bar with a San Miguel, first one I'd had in Cebu, cold in the way that only makes sense in that kind of heat, and did what I always do in a new environment. I watched. I noticed 2 men in particular, not because they were loud or because they drew attention. It was almost the opposite. One of them was clearly at ease in a way that seemed genuine rather than performed, sitting with a Filipino woman who was laughing at something he'd said, relaxed in his body in the way of someone who'd been somewhere long enough that he'd stopped tracking himself. The other was at the far end of the bar, drinking slightly faster than everyone else and looking out at the room with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that isn't coming out right. I didn't know their names yet, but I recognized both of them. Not them, specifically. I recognized the 2 things they recognized, the 2 things they represented. I ordered a second, San Miguel, found a seat, and waited for the quiz to start. His name was Phil. 61, from Harrogate in Yorkshire, which he mentioned within the first 5 minutes not because he was proud of it, but because someone had asked, and that was the answer. He had the compact, unhurried quality of a man who has stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. His wife, Ligaya, sat beside him through most of the quiz with a glass of something cold and a phone she checked occasionally, and the 2 of them had the specific ease of people who've been together long enough that they don't need to be talking to be comfortable in each other's company. I've been married 3 times. I know what that looks like. I know how rare it is. The other one was Gary, Phoenix, Arizona. 58. He told me this the 2nd Thursday, when we ended up sitting near each other during a lull between rounds. Gary had a way of giving you information about himself in the slightly compressed manner of someone who's been asked these questions many times and has edited down to the essentials. How long have you been here? 2 years. Do you like it? He made a face that I cannot adequately describe except to say that it cannot adequately describe except to say that it contained at least 4 different answers simultaneously. I became a regular. I'm not sure it was a conscious decision so much as the absence of a reason not to go. It was Thursday. The San Miguel was cold. The quiz kept my brain moving, and Kiaran did a reasonable chicken inasal on a paper plate that came with the entry fee. Gradually, over 3 or 4 Thursdays, the shape of both men's situations became clearer. I wasn't prying. I just asked questions the way I always ask questions. Practical, specific, not leading, and listened to what came back. Phil's story, assembled over several conversations, was almost aggravating. He'd come to Cebu 6 years ago after taking early retirement from a manufacturing firm in Leeds. He'd done his research. He'd arrived with a plan. He met Ligaya through a mutual acquaintance about 2 months in. She was a nurse at Changhua Hospital, educated, self-sufficient, not looking to be rescued by anyone. Within the first month of seeing her seriously, he'd asked to meet her family. Within the second month, he'd sat down with her parents and her 2 older brothers and had what he called, very plainly, the money conversation. He told them what his pension was, what it covered, what he could realistically contribute to the family on a fixed, ongoing basis. He named a figure, 8,000 pesos a month, about €130, first of every month, reliable as a direct debit. And he named the rule that went with it, nothing additional without 2 weeks' notice and a specific reason discussed in advance. He said the family hadn't exactly applauded. There was a period of readjustment, but they'd respected it. Because it was honest. Because there was nothing ambiguous to maneuver around. 6 years. No drama. A small apartment in a quiet part of Marabel, low costs, good life by his account. Ligaya still worked, which he'd always thought was important, not because he needed her to, but because a woman with her own income and her own purpose is a different proposition than one who's entirely dependent, and he'd had the sense to understand that before it became a problem. I found myself taking mental notes, which, professionally, is exactly what I do when someone describes a system that works. Gary's situation required more Thursdays to fully map. He didn't tell it all at once. It came out in pieces, which is probably how it had happened to him, piece by piece, none of it individually alarming. He'd come to Cebu 2 years ago after a divorce that had cost him more than he wanted to discuss. He'd met a woman named Donna about 3 months in, at a birthday party, and the relationship had been, by his description, genuinely good, warm, real. He believed that. He still believed it, actually, and that was the part that made the rest of it harder to sit with. The first request had come about 4 months in. Her mother needed medication, 15,000 pesos. About €240. Gary had done the conversion in his head, the way we all do, and thought, that's less than I spend on a bad weekend back home. He gave it without making anything of it. And that, really, was that. Except it wasn't. He listed them for me one Thursday evening in March, just the 2 of us at the bar while Kiaran was doing the final quiz round at the other end of the room. The roof repair on the family house in Bohol, 45,000 pesos, €720. The brothers' college semester fees, 80,000 pesos. The father's hospital admission for chest pain that turned out to be anxiety, 60,000 pesos, just under €1,000. A motorcycle for the brother-in-law who needed it for work, 90,000 pesos, €1,440. Because how do you argue against a man needing transport for work? On and on. 11 separate occasions over 22 months. Each one, as Gary said, completely reasonable on its own terms. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and put a notebook on the bar. I want to tell you that I kept my face neutral, but internally, a spiral-bound notebook, the same kind I used, the same corner shop variety, I had a moment that I can only describe as recognition. The specific, uncomfortable recognition of seeing yourself reflected in the wrong direction. Gary opened it to a page near the back. A running total, in ballpoint pen, in the careful handwriting of a man who tracks things. 1.84 million pesos. The conversion in euros was written underneath in smaller figures. 30,000 euros approximately. 26 months of a relationship. He closed the notebook, took a drink. Every single one of those amounts, he said, was completely reasonable on its own. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. The thing that stayed with me wasn't the total. 30,000 euro is a significant amount, but it's not a ruin-your-life amount, and Gary still had enough to get home and restart, which he was in the process of doing. What stayed with me was the architecture. The way each step had been sized to stay below whatever threshold would have triggered a different response. 15,000 pesos doesn't make you stop and reassess. 45,000 is uncomfortable but survivable. 80,000 is a lot, but it's for education. Each figure, individually, made a kind of sense. It was only when Gary laid them end to end in that notebook that the structure became visible. And Gary had a notebook. He'd been logging it. He had the same instinct I had, the same professional reflex toward documentation and control, and it hadn't protected him at all. It had just recorded the process with precision. I drove home that night. Well, I took a grab, I don't drive here, and sat for a while with my own notebook open on the kitchen table. I looked at what I'd written in it since February. Apartment rent, food, utilities. The entry fee for Kieran's quiz, small, ordinary expenses, all accounted for, all under control. I thought about Phil's conversation with Ligaya's family, the one he'd had in month 2, before there was anything to lose, when the terms could still be set honestly. And I thought about Gary's notebook with its running total in smaller figures underneath. Same instinct. Entirely different outcomes. The notebook isn't protection. I understood that now in a way I hadn't before. The notebook just tells you, very accurately, how much you've lost. I closed it and went to bed. I had no particular reason to think any of this was immediately relevant to my own situation. I wasn't in a relationship. I wasn't being asked for anything. I was just a man with a notebook in a serviced apartment in La Hougue, taking note of things. Which is, of course, precisely the sort of thing you think right before it becomes relevant. His wife Jonalyn had a colleague turning 40, function room hired at a place in Mandaue, 30 or 40 people. Come along if you want. Ciaran put it to 3 or 4 of the Thursday regulars with the casual generosity of a man who'd been in Cebu long enough that social occasions had stopped requiring justification. I nearly said no. I'd been saying no to things by default for most of my adult life, which my first wife would have called emotionally absent, and which I preferred to call efficient. I went because it was a Saturday, and the alternative was another afternoon in SM Seaside watching Filipino teenagers take photos of their food. The function room was on the second floor of a building off AS Fortuna Street. Paper decorations, a long table of food, somebody's playlist running through a Bluetooth speaker that kept cutting out. The birthday woman's relatives had taken over most of the seating. A few of Ciaran's crowd stood near the drinks table, looking mildly content, which for Western men at Filipino social events is generally the best of. I was introduced to Marabel by a woman whose name I've since forgotten, a friend of Jonalyn's who seemed to have appointed herself as a social coordinator for the evening. Marabel, about 41, medical receptionist at a clinic in Mandaue. Originally from Ormoc in Leyte, which I didn't know at the time, was about a 5-hour ferry ride away. She was introduced to me in the way that people are sometimes introduced at parties when the introducer has a theory about why you'd get on, and then the introducer immediately disappeared, as they do. She didn't perform interest in me. That's the first thing I noticed. A lot of the social interactions I'd had in Cebu up to that point had a particular quality, warm, curious, slightly focused in a way I wasn't quite used to. and I'd been reading it carefully for what it meant. Marabel just looked at me with the mild assessment of someone deciding whether a conversation was worth having, and apparently decided yes, and asked me what I'd thought of the food. Not where was I from, not how long had I been here, not what did I do. The food. There was pansy on the table, and she said her aunt made better pansy than this, and that the secret was the timing, which she'd tried to explain to the aunt repeatedly to no avail. I told her the pansy was fine. She said that was the problem with people who didn't know good pansy. They thought fine was the same as good, and that was how it started. Not with significance. With a minor disagreement about noodles. I think about the timing of that evening a lot. Gary had just left the country. This was a few weeks after our last Thursday, his chair empty, Ciaran quietly mentioning he'd headed back to Phoenix. Phil was there that first night in April when I mentioned I'd met someone at Jonalyn's colleague's party, and he'd nodded in that measured Yorkshire way of his and said good, and that was about it. I had all the information I needed. I had Gary's notebook total still sitting in the back of my head. I had Phil's approach written nowhere but memorized regardless. I was, as I would have said in any profession. The first few weeks were coffee, mostly. The cafe near her clinic on Plaridel Street, Tuesday and Thursday lunches, sometimes a Friday evening. She ordered the same thing each time, iced black coffee and whatever sandwich was on the board, and ate quickly because she only had an hour. She talked about her work, the way people talk about things they're competent at, but not particularly enchanted by. She talked about Cebu versus Leyte, the way anyone talks about a place they're from and a place they've ended up, with a kind of resigned fondness for both. She asked me questions about Ireland that were specific and occasionally surprising. She wanted to know about the Irish language and whether people actually spoke it. And when I said sort of, she found this funnier than I expected. She didn't ask me what I owned. Didn't ask about my pension, my savings, what my apartment cost. Didn't ask if I had property back home. The subjects that seemed to arrive quite quickly in some conversations here never appeared. I kept waiting for them the way you wait for a noise in an old building, tensed for something that might or might not come. By May, we were seeing each other most weeks. She met me once at the Ayala Center on a Saturday, more from necessity than occasion. She needed something from Watson's. We walked around for a bit, ate at the food court, and I noticed the easy way she moved through a place she knew well, and I was still learning. Her two friends joined us for about an hour, two women from her clinic, who spoke to me politely in very good English, and then largely talked to Marabel in Cebuano, which I didn't understand and didn't mind. There's something uncomplicated about being in a conversation you can't follow. You just exist in it without performing. Nothing had been asked of me. This is what I keep returning to when I try to explain it. By the beginning of June, 2 months of regular contact, some degree of genuine warmth on both sides, and not a single euro had moved in any direction. After Gary and his 11 requests, I'd been ready, alert. And there was nothing to be alert about, which I was beginning to suspect was itself a kind of vulnerability. She mentioned her father in passing one afternoon. We were outside the clinic, end of her lunch break, and she said he'd had dialysis that morning and she needed to get back in case there were messages. Not asking me anything, not leading anywhere. Just mentioning it the way you mention facts about your life to someone who has become a regular presence in it. Her father had kidney disease. He'd been on dialysis for about a year. It was expensive. She didn't say how expensive. Didn't invite me to calculate anything. Then she went back into the clinic and I walked back to where I'd parked myself and got on with my afternoon. But I thought about it. I couldn't quite not think about it, not because it had been designed to make me think about it. I genuinely don't believe it was. Not that time, but because I'd spent 2 months waiting for a particular signal, and something in me had decided this was adjacent enough to count. It probably wasn't. The remark seemed genuine. The tiredness around her eyes when she said it seemed genuine. Her father being ill seemed, by every indication available to me, to simply be true. She never asked. She just let me know things. And there is a difference between those two actions. There is a real and meaningful difference, and I understood it intellectually, and it still worked. On me. A man with a notebook and 26 years of diagnosing systems. It still worked. That's what I want you to understand before we get to the next part. This wasn't stupidity. It wasn't even naivety exactly. It was something more specific than that, and more uncomfortable. It was a man who had identified the mechanism, who had watched it operate on someone else, who had told him, paying attention turns out not to be the same thing as being protected. I know that now. I knew it then, in a way. I just didn't know it the way you know something when it's actually happening to you. The month of June arrived. By then I was comfortable in a way I hadn't planned on being. Not comfortable the way a waiting room is comfortable. Something else. Something else. Something else. Something I hadn't felt in a while and didn't have a clean word for. Which is, of course, exactly when things started to cost money. It was a Tuesday in early June. We were at the cafe on Plaridel Street. She mentioned the dialysis again. This time with a number attached. 6,000 pesos per session. 3 sessions a week. She said it the way she said most things, matter-of-factly, not building toward anything, just filling in a detail she'd previously left vague. She was covering what she could. Her salary at the clinic was decent by local standards, but not by dialysis standards. She didn't say, "Can you help?" She said, "It's a lot." And then she drank her coffee. I did the arithmetic in my head without being asked. That's what I do. 72,000 pesos a month, just for the machine time. Not counting the medications, not counting the transport from Leyte to wherever he was getting treatment, not counting the various other costs that surround a person who is seriously ill. In euros, 72,000 pesos is about 1,200 per month. On a receptionist's salary, I offered 12,000 pesos, about 200 euro. I didn't frame it as a loan. I didn't frame it as anything in particular. I just said that I could help a bit with the costs this month. She said thank you in the same register she'd used to tell me about the costs, not effusively, not dismissively, just thank you, and we talked about something else. I went home and opened the notebook, wrote it down dialysis contribution, converted it stared at it for a moment, then I went and made tea. Here's what I told myself. This is not Gary's situation. Gary's situation involved a pattern. This was one contribution that is not ambiguous. 200 euro is, in the context of my savings and pension, genuinely nothing. It's less than a bad week of groceries in Cork. It's less than 1 month's broadband and TV package that I was no longer paying. I had identified the rationalization mechanism in someone else. I was now applying it to myself with full awareness of what I was doing, and the awareness made no difference whatsoever. I knew this. I want to be very clear that I knew this. Her niece Ella, 17, sharp. The kind of results that open doors if you can afford the door fee. She'd qualified for a nursing program at a college in Cebu City. Marabel mentioned this over lunch with a mixture of pride and the particular tired expression of someone doing financial sums that aren't resolving. The enrollment fee plus the first semester came to 38,000 pesos total. Marabel was covering the bulk of it. The gap was 12,000. 12,000 pesos, 200 euro, nursing, 17 years old. I know how it sounds. I know exactly how it sounds because I heard Gary describe the exact same internal monologue. Education. You can't argue with education. It's an investment in a person's future. It's not a roof repair. It's not a motorcycle. It's a girl who worked hard and deserves a chance. All of that was true. All of it. I believed it when I thought it. I believed it when I thought it. I believed it when I thought it. And I still believe it now. Ella probably is bright. The college fees probably were. The situation was almost certainly genuine. I gave it. Transferred 12,000 pesos via GCash, which took about 40 seconds and felt, in the moment, like the right thing to do. I wrote it in the notebook. 9T 12,000. Ella's school. Looked at the entry. Looked at the one above it. Turned to a clean page and wrote a running total. 9T 4,000. 9T 24,000. I sat with that for a while. The apartment was quiet except for the air conditioning and the distant sound of a basketball bouncing off concrete from the court 2 streets over. I thought about Gary's total and how it had looked reasonable right up until it looked like 30,000 euro. I thought about the architecture. The way each individual amount was sized to stay beneath whatever number would make a reasonable man say, "Hold on." And I thought, I should have had Phil's conversation 2 months ago. I should have sat down with her, not with her family. We hadn't even got to that stage. The Leyte trip kept being next month, and said clearly what I could offer and what I couldn't. Set the terms, made it honest on both sides, not as a transaction, but as a clarity. The way Phil had done it in month 2, when the leverage still existed. I hadn't done that. I'd done Gary's version instead, absorbing, rationalizing, logging, while telling myself I was doing something fundamentally different because I was conscious of what I was doing. Consciousness is not a strategy. I understand that now. You can be fully aware that you're walking in a particular direction and still end up wherever that direction leads. The family visit to Lady was still being arranged. We'd talked about it twice. Both times there'd been a reason it couldn't happen that month. Her father's health, work schedules, a cousin's wedding in Ormoc that complicated the timing. I hadn't pushed. Partly because pushing felt presumptuous. Partly because I'd been told in various YouTube videos and expat forums that Filipino families take time, that you can't rush the introduction, that it means something serious when it happens, and therefore the conditions have to be right. I'd accepted all of this as reasonable. I think about that now. I do. The Leyte visit never being quite the right month. Whether it meant nothing. I genuinely don't know. Marabel never struck me as a person running a strategy. She wasn't warm in the performed way that some people are warm. She was sometimes impatient with me and occasionally a bit brusque in a way that felt real precisely because it wasn't flattering. But I also know that the absence of obvious strategy isn't the same as the absence of a dynamic. The dynamic doesn't require anyone to be consciously running it. It just requires 2 people behaving in ways that produce a particular result. I closed the notebook, wrote nothing else in it that evening. The thing that I'm not proud of, and I said I'd be honest, so here it is that part of me was relieved by the smallness of the total. 24,000 pesos, 400 euro. That's a rounding error against my savings. Part of me thought, well, even if this goes the way Gary's went, even if the requests accumulate, I have enough runway to see what this is before it becomes serious. I had built myself a cushion of tolerance, and I was sitting on it comfortably and telling myself that was caution. It wasn't caution. I didn't know it then, or I knew it the way you know something that you're not ready to act on. One kept the notebook entry, drank the tea, went to bed. July passed. August arrived, hot and wet and loud with rain that came down in the afternoons like a system reboot. I kept meeting Marabel on Tuesdays and Thursdays and nothing was asked of me in those weeks. We went to the Cebu Mercado night market one Friday, and she bought fish balls from a stall and ate them standing up and made a face at me that suggested she found my reluctance to try them personally disappointing. I ate too. They were. She still hadn't introduced me to her family. I still hadn't had Phil's conversation. The notebook had 2 entries under additional expenditure and a running total that was, objectively, nothing. Everything was fine. I just couldn't quite get comfortable with how fine it was. Gary's chair was empty. It had been empty for 2 Thursdays by the time the conversation with Phil happened, and it had a specific quality to it. That empty chair. Not dramatic, just absent, the way a person's absence is most noticeable in the places they used to occupy by habit. Ciaran had mentioned it the first Thursday after Gary left, with the careful neutrality of someone who has seen men arrive and depart from this particular barstool for 11 years and has made his peace with the rhythm of it. Gone back to Phoenix, he said. Family stuff. Which might have been true, which might have been the polite version. Either way, Gary was gone, and the chair was there, and I found myself not sitting in it. It was late August. The wet season had settled in properly by then, the kind of rain that arrives every afternoon with complete predictability and absolute commitment, hammering the zinc roofs and filling the gutters and turning the roads briefly into shallow rivers, and then stopping, and then the sun coming back out as though nothing had happened. I'd come to find it oddly comforting. It was the one weather event in my day that happened exactly when expected. The quiz had finished. Most of the group drifted off around 9:30. A Norwegian lad who worked remotely needed to be up early. A Canadian couple who were island hopping caught their grab. Phil and I ended up the last 2 at the table with a pair of San Miguels and the remains of the chicken inasal. Ligaya had gone home earlier. She had an early shift at Chonghua the following morning. We talked about ordinary things for a while. The price of apartments in Mabolo, which had gone up. A new Turo place that Ciaran had discovered near the South Road properties that was apparently exceptional. Phil's opinion of the current state of English football, which he delivered with the resigned certainty of a man who has been disappointed so many times, it has ceased to cause him pain. Then, without particular preamble, he asked how things were going with the woman I'd mentioned. I gave him what I thought was a measured, balanced summary. Marabel, 4 months. Good company. Nothing concerning. Nothing concerning. Financially, I said this specifically, because he would understand why I was saying it specifically. A couple of small contributions to family costs. Medical situation with her father. Both amounts modest. Running total not significant. Later visit being arranged. Things generally positive. Phil listened to all of this without interrupting. He has that quality, the ability to hear a thing before responding to it, which I've always considered a sign of actual intelligence rather than the performed kind. Then he asked, quite simply, had I had the conversation yet? I knew which conversation he meant. I said not exactly. He nodded. Not in a judging way, more the way a doctor nods when you describe a symptom he was expecting to hear. And then he told me for the first time in full detail rather than in passing reference exactly how he'd handled it with Ligaya's family. He'd sat down with her parents and her 2 older brothers. This was month 2, he said, which I noted at the family home in Talisay. He had brought mango cake from a bakery near his apartment because arriving empty-handed is not done, and he had sat at their table and drunk the coffee they gave him, and then, when the moment was right, had said plainly what he earned, what he needed to live on himself, and what he could reliably contribute to them on a monthly basis. 8,000 pesos. 8,000 pesos. Every first of the month. Like a bill. Not contingent on anything, not conditional on behavior or mood or whether the relationship was going well that week. Reliable. And nothing beyond that without 2 weeks' notice and a reason discussed in advance. The family had gone quiet, he said. One of the brothers had looked at the other brother. The mother had said something in Cebuano that Ligaya translated as not directly relevant. There had been a period of maybe 10 minutes that felt longer, in which Phil drank his coffee and didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances. And then they'd agreed, not because they loved it, but because it was clear. Because the clarity itself was a kind of respect, it said, I take this seriously enough to, and because there was nothing left undefined that could later be defined in their favor. 6 years, he said again. No drama. I asked him why he'd done it in month 2 rather than waiting. He looked at me with mild patience. The conversation gets harder, he said, the longer you wait. By the time most men have it, they've already given enough that the terms they're setting feel like a withdrawal rather than an agreement. The family hears he's changing the rules now because he wants to give less. But if you have it early, before there's a pattern, before there's an amount they've come to expect, it just sounds like, this is who I am and what I can do. You've lost nothing by having it early. You lose leverage every week you don't. I went home and grabbed a driver had the radio on, some Filipino pop song that I didn't know, cheerful and slightly melancholy the way that music often is. The rain had stopped and the road was wet and bright with reflected streetlights. I went in, put the kettle on, and opened the notebook. I looked at the 2 entries. 12,000, Diana, 12,000, Ella's school. The running total, 24,000 pesos. 400 euro. Then I looked at the other things I hadn't written down. No family meeting, despite 4 months. The Leyte trip, now its 4th consecutive month of being arranged for next month. No conversation about what I could offer on an ongoing basis. No structure. No terms. Just me, absorbing and rationalizing, with a notebook that recorded the amounts and a head full of framework that I had conspicuously failed to apply. I'd watched Gary do. I had understood, intellectually, exactly what it looked like. And then I had done a version of it myself, slower and smaller but structurally identical, while telling myself the structural awareness was the same as structural protection. It isn't. That's the thing. You can see the architecture clearly and still walk into it, because the architecture isn't what gets you. What gets you is the loneliness underneath the awareness. The part of you that wants the thing to be straightforward, that wants to believe the ease you've been feeling is just ease, and not the particular ease of a dynamic that hasn't fully revealed its terms yet. I sat with that for a while. The kettle boiled. I made the tea. I thought about Marabel. I genuinely didn't think she was running a strategy. I don't think that now either. I think she was a person with a sick father and a clever niece and a receptionist's salary, and a foreign man in her life who had money she didn't, and who had twice demonstrated willingness to help when the costs were small enough not to feel like a decision. I think that dynamic, left unaddressed, would continue producing the same results regardless of her intentions. The intentions were almost beside the point. The structure was the problem, and I had built the structure by not building anything else. The conversation I needed to have, I'd missed month 2, I'd missed month 3. Now I was at month 5, and the amounts were still small and the pattern was still nascent, and I was sitting in my kitchen at 10:30 at night, knowing that the conversation would now be harder to have than it would have been in April, and harder again in October, and possibly impossible to have, well, if I left it long enough, that it started to look like a withdrawal. I closed the notebook. The following Tuesday we met at the usual cafe on Plaridel Street. Her iced coffee, my regular coffee, the ordinary rhythm of it. We talked for a while. And then I told her, quite directly, that I was planning to return to Ireland, that I needed to sort some things at home, that I didn't have a date yet, but it would likely be within the month. She went still for a moment, not dramatically. Just the brief stillness of someone recalibrating. She asked if it was because of something she'd done. I said no. And that was true, as far as it went. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She asked if I would stay in touch, and I said I thought probably not in the way we'd been in touch. She nodded at that slowly, with the expression of someone who had perhaps been waiting for a version of this conversation and was processing the particular shape it had arrived in. There was a sadness to it that I hadn't anticipated. Not from her, or not only from her. From me. I hadn't come to Cebu looking for anything, and I had found something anyway. And I was sitting in a cafe on a Tuesday afternoon in August, choosing to end it for reasons that were correct and that I couldn't fully explain to her without explaining everything. And that felt, I don't have a better word for it, just sad. Not dramatic. Sad in the ordinary way that honest endings usually are. I gave a month's notice on the apartment. Ciaran raised an eyebrow at the Thursday quiz, and I told him I had things to sort at home, which was true in the way that incomplete explanations are true. Phil said he was sorry to hear it and meant it, I think. We had a last San Miguel and talked about nothing much. I didn't accuse Marabel of anything. There was nothing to accuse her of. That was, in some ways, the most complicated part of it. The last few weeks in Cebu have a particular quality, not grief. Something more like the feeling you get when a process completes, the slight deflation of a task that's been running in the background finally closing down. I settled the apartment, handed back the keys to the property manager, a young man named Jerome who'd fixed my air conditioning twice without complaint and always knocked before entering, which I'd appreciated more than I'd said. I did a last walk around Lahug on a Tuesday morning, coffee from the 7-Eleven, the same route I'd been walking since February. The Sorry store on the corner where the owner's daughter had started recognizing me and giving me my change without being asked. The basketball court where someone was always playing, 6 in the morning or 10 at night in the heat or after the rain, without apparent regard for anything except the ball and the hoop. The coffee shop on Salinas Drive where I'd seen the flyer that started all of it. Still there, still artisanal, still with the cork board near the door. I said goodbye to Ciaran and the Thursday regulars on the last Thursday. Ciaran shook my hand and said, "Come back," in the way that people say come back when they half mean it and half know that most people don't. Phil walked out with me at the end of the night and said, on the pavement outside, that he hoped I'd figure out whatever needed figuring out. I said I thought I had. He nodded, and we left it there. I flew home on a Saturday in late September. It rained at Dublin Airport, which seemed appropriate. I took the bus to Cork, got a taxi from the station to Ballincollig. Let myself into the flat, which smelled of nothing in particular, which is the smell of a place that's been empty for 9 months. I made tea, opened the notebook, did the accounting, 9 months in the Philippines. Apartment at 28,000 pesos a month, 252,000 pesos total, roughly €4,200. Food, transport, sundry expenses, the quiz entry fee every Thursday, the occasional trip, SM Seaside, one weekend on Malapascua Island to see what the fuss was about, a ferry to Bohol, because I felt I ought to see the Chocolate Hills while I was in the region. Total living costs reasonable, within what I'd budgeted, my pension covering most of it with the savings barely touched. Additional spend beyond living costs. 2 contributions of 12,000 pesos each, 24,000 pesos. And a third entry I hadn't mentioned yet, a parting gesture. Because I am apparently incapable of leaving anything completely clean, of 37,000 pesos, about €600, that I'd given to Marabel the last time we met, for her father's medication costs over the next 2 months, because the dialysis wasn't stopping just because I was leaving, and I knew it, and I couldn't not know it. I wrote that down too. No special category. Just Op 37,000. Departure. Total additional spend. 85,000 peso. It was not a devastating number. It was not nothing. It was the cost of 9 months of being, as I would charitably describe it, a man who understood a system, and then demonstrated that understanding by doing exactly what the system was designed to make him do. What I'd lost beyond the money was harder to account for, and I'll try anyway. I'd lost the version of myself I'd brought to Cebu, the one who had everything logged and color-coded and diagnosed in advance. The Philippines had found a variable in that system and adjusted for it quietly and with remarkable efficiency. And I found, sitting in my flat in Bolincalig in the October rain, that I could not be entirely indignant about this. I'd been warned. I'd understood the warning. I'd failed to act on it in time. That's not a Filipino problem. That's a Brendan problem. That's a Brendan problem. What I hadn't lost, one friendship with Phil, which I consider the best financial return of the entire enterprise, free with every Thursday quiz. One clear understanding of exactly where, and some months of Marabel's company, that were, in the parts I'm still able to access honestly, genuinely good. She was funny. She was direct. Her pansit observation on the night we met was entirely correct. I don't think she was a bad person. I think she was a person navigating a situation with the tools available to her, in a culture where a foreign man with savings represents something specific, and the expectations around that something are real and normal and not considered predatory by anyone involved. That's a cultural gap. I'd known about the gap and failed to bridge it in the one way that would have made a difference. The new notebook is a Musgrave own brand one, bought from a shop in Cork City on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened it to the first page and wrote Phil's approach, the figure, the rule, the principle. 8,000 pesos. First of the month. Nothing additional without 2 weeks' notice. And a reason discussed in advance. Arrive before the pattern develops. The clarity is the protection. I've booked a return flight to Cebu. Specific date. Not. I'll need to do a visa extension. You get 30 days on arrival. Extendable. And I'd already been through that process once, so the admin is familiar. I'll find a different apartment this time, probably. Or possibly the same building. I don't know what I'll find when I go back. I don't know if I'll meet someone or whether it'll work or whether... And I know which conversations to have, and when to have them, and what happens if you don't. For a man who spent 26 years on a help desk, that's most of the battle. The flat still feels large for one person. The broadband is still good. My son texted last week about something unrelated, which was nice. The pension arrives on the 1st of the month, regular as ever. I'm all right. But not the one where everything goes fine either, because those stories, while cheerful, aren't particularly useful to anyone thinking about making the same journey. At Inside the Philippines, we've spent years sitting with men who came here chasing something and paid a high price for it. But Brendan's story points at something those stories sometimes miss. The failure wasn't in going. The Philippines is not a trap. The Philippines is not a trap. The warmth here is real. The family obligations are real. The genuine relationships are real. And yes, the exploitation is real too, but it runs on exactly the same engine as the warmth, which is why it's so hard to see from inside it. The men who navigate this place well are not smarter than the men who don't. They're not luckier. They're not immune to loneliness or to the specific comfort of being wanted after a long time of not being wanted, after a long time of not being wanted. They're just prepared. They've had the conversation Phil had in month 2. They've established the terms before the pattern develops. They've arrived with their terms already written down, as someone once put it to us. Phil is not a special case. Phil is a man from Yorkshire who sat down with a family in Talisay and was honest with them about money before it became complicated. That conversation is available to anyone. Most men never have it at all. If you're watching this because you're planning a move, a visit, a relationship, this is what the channel has learned across all of these stories. Do the research Brendan did. Build the spreadsheet. Find the apartment. But on day 1 or day 2 or whenever you meet someone who matters, have the conversation. Not as a transaction, as a respect. Because the Philippines rewards honesty more than most places and punishes ambiguity more than most places, and the only way to know which version you're in is to establish the terms before you find out the hard way. Brendan has a flight booked for March. He has a new notebook. We'll see how it goes. Thanks for watching Inside the Philippines. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived something like it, or avoided something like it, or are somewhere in the middle of it right now, tell us. Every story in this community makes the next person a little better prepared. And if you haven't already, there are links below to some stories that sit alongside Brendan's, the ones that ended differently, and the ones that ended the same way for different reasons. Take care of yourselves out there.